Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It's a big week for the economy. Yesterday, the September quarter GDP was released, revealing just how much damage the Delta lockdowns did to the economy. The 1.9% contraction for the quarter was perhaps better than expected, with many economists forecasting the economy would shrink by closer to 3%. Felicity Emmett is a senior economist at ANZ and my guest this morning. Felicity, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much for having me, Sean.
So, Felicity, was yesterday's number 1.9% lower than you expected?
Look, it was a bit of a smaller fall than we expected. And certainly when we look back to expectations, a couple of months ago, it was certainly a fair bit better than expectations. And, we can all say, oh, this number's old, it's so dated, it's from, more than 3 months ago, really. Actually, what today shows is that the hole in the economy that Delta has created is a bit smaller, so the recovery from it will be a bit quicker. So it is really, quite good news, I think.
Okay, so if we break it down, what were some of the details of it, which were either on the upside or the downside? So if we start with households.
Yes, look, really, that's where the surprise was. We saw household consumption fall 4.8%, which was less than we were expecting. We were expecting something more like down 5.8%. And that's largely because services held up better than expected. And now services were always going to be hard hit because you obviously can't use those when you're forced to stay at home. But the declines weren't as large. They were down about 5%. If we look at, sort of non-retail, down about 5%. So really not too bad a result. When we look back to the second quarter of last year, when we had the national lockdown, then services spending was down something like 13%. So a much better outcome than that.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously it was Victoria, New South Wales and the ACT were locked down this time around, and it wasn't a national economy. Notwithstanding that, it does seem that people handled the lockdown better this time around, and as a result, the economic consequence wasn't quite as bad.
That's absolutely correct. So, yes, the lockdowns were really confined to, as you say, New South Wales, Victoria and ACT. However, those lockdowns were much longer than was the case in the second quarter last year. And New South Wales and Victoria obviously make up the largest proportion of the economy, accounting for about 50%. So I think the fact that the decline this quarter was just down 1.9 compared to down 7% in the second quarter last year really is because businesses and households have both managed the shutdown much better. So, businesses now can very easily switch to work from home. Workers have really got used to that sort of system. Restaurants can easily shift to takeaway. Lots of businesses have really managed to adapt very quickly. And we saw this as well when we look at measures of things like business and consumer confidence. Through the quarter, they didn't decline anywhere near as much as they did in the national lockdown last year, even if we look on a state-by-state basis. And I think that's because we've, managed to adapt really well.
Okay. Exports, they're helping things out?
Well, that's a tricky one. So net exports added 1 percentage point to growth. So it provided a bit of an offset to the weakness in demand. But that was actually mostly because of a 4% fall in imports. It wasn't because exports were really strong. It's because imports were super weak. So what will happen is in the third quarter, when demand picks up, we will get probably a reversal of that. So, and net exports will probably subtract from GDP. So that's probably something to watch out for. But also there's lots of, pluses and minuses in here. The net exports contribution also partly offset the big drag that we had from inventories. Now, inventories were run down quite sharply, particularly in the wholesale sector. Now, that's also probably a bit of borrowing or reflecting weak imports. So there's a bit of give and take in the numbers there. And as I say, imports will probably bounce back next quarter, and then inventories will probably also, rather than being a drag, they will likely contribute next quarter as well.
Stay with me, Felicity. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Felicity Emmett, ANZ Senior Economist. Okay, so at the beginning you said the thing about the economy not contracting as much as expected during the September means it didn't put as big a hole in the economy, which is a better starting point for the December quarter, the current quarter. What are you expecting this quarter?
Look, I think we'll see a pretty solid bounce. I mean, it's early days at the moment, but we're expecting a bounce in the order of about 3% in the December quarter. We've seen with retail sales, they were up nearly 5% in October. We know that the Black Friday sales went really well. So consumers are definitely out there ready to spend. And consumers are in a really good position to spend. You know, we saw in the Q3 report that the household saving rate is now back up to nearly 20%, not as high as it was in the lockdown last year, but still incredibly high. So what we've seen is all the way through the pandemic is that household saving rate has been very elevated. So every quarter households are saving quite a bit out of their income. And what they've done with that, or with some of that, is that they've put it into the bank. And so we've seen a massive increase in bank deposits, you know, in the order of about 160 billion since the pandemic started. And so what that means is that households are in a really, really good position to spend up. International borders are reopening, but that's likely to be very slow, especially now with Omicron. But households really are, I think, really ready and willing to spend. And that's why we think the recovery, both in the December quarter and in 2022, will be largely consumer driven. And I think the outlook there is very positive.
Okay, so if we can bring that back sort of away from the economists, more to people like myself, Felicity, what's it mean for house prices? What do you think house prices will do given that the economy will be expanding into next year? What's your view on house prices?
Well, house prices have had a magnificent run over the past year or so. New numbers out today showing that prices have risen, I think, 22% or so in the past year. And low rates have really helped to drive that really amazing sort of performance there. Now, I think that we're not going to see a repeat of that. And there's a few reasons for that. We've seen a big increase in supply coming on stream. Last weekend, we had a record weekend for auction volumes. We've had a big increase in the number of new listings for private sales after a period when the market was really very tight. And so this increase in supply is, I think, taking some of the heat out of the market. And that's why we've already seen the monthly price gains start to moderate. When you look back to March of this year, I think capital city prices rose 2.6%, whereas the November numbers have them up 1.1%. So we're already seeing a moderation there. And I think that's likely to continue. And a couple of other factors are likely to add to that. And one is the macroprudential tightening that we had from APRA that they announced in early October, with an increase in the mortgage serviceability buffer from 2.5% to 3%. That will mean people can't borrow quite as much, and that will flow through into prices. And also we're seeing increases in fixed mortgage rates. Now, even without the Reserve Bank adjusting the cash rate, the market rates have lifted, and that's flowing through into higher fixed mortgage rates. So that will also help, I think, to take some of the heat out of the housing market. But not enough, though, to turn prices negative, and we think that we'll still get more moderate gains next year. And so we're looking for a rise of about 6% on average across the capital cities next year before higher rates really start to bite in 2023, when we expect to get a modest decline. Now, we're looking at about 4% decline at the moment, which is really not very much when you think that that's following 6% in 2022 and more than 20% that we've seen this year.
Okay, so what about interest rates? You talked about fixed rate loans. Variable rate loans will rise certainly when the Reserve Bank lifts the official cash rate. That's dependent in large part to inflation and wages. We've seen in the last 36 hours that the US Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, saying that inflation can't really be considered just transitory anymore. How do you boil that down for Australia in terms of the inflation outlook and what that means for interest rates?
Yeah, and this is the million-dollar question at the moment. Look, we don't expect the Reserve Bank to start lifting rates until the first half of 2023. We don't think that inflation will pick up as much here. We think wages will take longer to pick up here than has been the case around the world. So we think that probably the market's got a little bit ahead of itself, pricing in around 90 basis points of interest rate hikes over the coming year. So I think it is a little bit different here. The Reserve Bank has missed its inflation target for a long time, and that has largely been because it has expected wages to pick up when they haven't. And, we've had a lot of global reasons why wages growth has been slow, but in Australia, there's been a few other reasons, and Phil Lowe outlined some of the reasons why wages will be slower to pick up here in a speech a couple of weeks ago. And, one of those is the fact that we have these enterprise bargaining agreements. Now, the wage rises they're getting in those enterprise bargaining agreements at the moment are still in the sort of low twos, and those agreements go for 2 or 3 years. And so that provides a degree of inertia. We also have the minimum wage setting system that comes through annually and sets the minimum wage. And we have public sector caps on wages growth. So all those things are going to limit the pickup in wages here. And so it's unlikely that we're going to see the sorts of really sharp lifts in wages growth that we've seen in the US or in New Zealand or the UK here in Australia. And so that means it's going to be longer before the Reserve Bank is comfortable that inflation is in the band sustainably. It's all very well to have some of these pandemic-induced lifts in inflation, but they're not going to be sustained unless the price pressures sort of transfer into wages. And I think in Australia, that will take a bit longer than has been the case overseas. So I think the RBA will lag the other central banks, perhaps not by as much as they think. After the latest statement on monetary policy, when Phil Lowe spoke, he said that he still really felt the forecasts were consistent with the cash rate staying unchanged until 2024. I don't think that will be the case, but if it's earlier, that will be a success story really for the RBA because it will mean that they've achieved their goals earlier.
Felicity, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Felicity Emmett, ANZ Senior Economist. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.